Welcome to the Lowy Institute Distinguished Speakers series of lectures. This particular event is held under the auspices of the Lowy Institute's partnership with the Nuclear Security Project of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. The Nuclear Threat Initiative comes out of the work of former Secretaries of State George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, former Defense Secretary Bill Perry and Senator Sam Nunn, who are known collectively in the United States now as the Gang of Four, from a number of articles that they've published in the Wall Street Journal. And it's great to see the partnership that's developed between the Lowy Institute and the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Our speaker today, Professor Sir Laurence Freedman, is one of my oldest and closest friends in this business. There are three things I want to tell you about him. The Lowy Institute is about quality, and there is no higher quality analyst in our business than Laurence Freedman. He's written some wonderful books in our field, particularly The Evolution of Nuclear Strategy. He's focused a good deal on crises in the superpower relationship and wars of the recent era. He did the British official history of the war in the Falklands, and he's just produced a fascinating book on the politics of the Middle East called Choose Your Enemy. I recommend that very warmly to you. Second thing I should tell you about Laurie is that he is a great academic leader as well as a writer and commentator. Laurie became head of the Department of War Studies at King's College in 1982, the year that I became director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. We were just across the road from each other. It was the time of the Thatcher Ice Age for academic research. And a lot of British academics got very down in the dumps and really refused to do very much to help themselves, but that was not Laurie. Laurie got out there and got foundation grants and talked the British government, amongst other agencies, into putting money into his department. And it built up, I think, from something like 30 students in the early days to 600. Now, it is a huge operation, and as you would expect for something led by Laurie, it runs at a very high level of quality. The third thing I should tell you is that he is a very warm human being. He was the first Brit to invite me to lunch when I went to London in 1982, and we went across the road to a wine bar called Ball's Brothers. I won't say we talked balls, but out of that came a very long-standing friendship. I will not weary you with the list of boards that we have worked on together, both in connection with the International Institute for Strategic Studies and King's College and lots of other places. But I'm absolutely delighted to be able to chair this occasion, and I invite Laurie to speak to us on nuclear disarmament, the need for a new theory. Laurie.
Well, thank you very much for that. It's always great to be in Australia, and always good to renew our friendship. Well, nuclear disarmament is back in vogue. It may be that the various nuclear crises over Iran and North Korea are starting to have a cumulative effect, or that the developing bad temper between Russia and NATO countries has triggered fears of a return to the Cold War, or that the shift in the international mood as a result of the economic crisis has encouraged a general pessimism about the ability of the community of states to cope with big challenges. Perhaps it's just a developing view that there's a collection of issues here that's too serious to be neglected much longer. It's over 60 years since the first and only time the nuclear weapons were used in anger. But can we really expect this record of non-use to continue indefinitely? Are we not riding our luck? For whatever reason, the last couple of years have seen a series of initiatives designed to convince international leaders that the time has come to make a serious effort to eliminate nuclear arsenals. The aspiration is reflected in opinion pieces from elder statesmen, which I can now, because Bob has introduced them, refer to simply as the Gang of Four, The Global Zero Initiative, the Stimson Center, which was launched in Paris last December, has acquired many distinguished signatures, and there is also, as Bob mentioned, the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, chaired by Gareth Evans and Yuriko Kawaguchi, and that's now begun its work. President Obama has promised that he will seek a world in which there are no nuclear weapons. While this would not be unilateral, he promised he would work with Russia to dramatically reduce the stockpiles of our nuclear weapons. Now, this issue has reached the international agenda because key members of the policy-making elite have decided to take it seriously rather than because of a surge of public opinion or in response to mass protests. While the environmental movement has influenced political discourse at all levels, from the local to the global, this is not the case this time round with nuclear disarmament. The major powers currently do very little that is overtly provocative in this area compared to, say, 20 years ago. Again, I'll refer back to the ice age that Bob was mentioning of the early Thatcher years and the provocative statements of President Reagan, proposals to bring cruise missiles into Europe, which could bring hundreds of thousands onto Europe's streets, and the freeze movement in the United States, which gained considerable support in reaction to Reagan's apparently cavalier attitude towards nuclear issues, although we now find out that Reagan was actually a barely closeted abolitionist himself. These days, the nuclear powers make few large claims for the strategic value of their arsenals, but deny that they'd be sorry to lose them altogether, but still work in keeping them at a decent state of repair. Even when it comes to proliferation issues, peace groups are reluctant to take the claims of Western governments at face value and suspect instead that complaints about individual proliferators are Western pretexts for wider strategic interests and must depend on exaggeration, with the intelligence dossiers on Iraq cited as evidence for the prosecution, as well as the claims about proliferation reeking of hypocrisy and double standards. For all these reasons, there's interest in the nuclear issue, but hardly an intellectual ferment associated with this revived interest in nuclear disarmament. The old hands in the field are picking up where they left off, dusting down a variety of treaty proposals that will move governments in the right direction, while the same cautionary notes as before are being sounded by those who do not think disarmament should be pursued without regard for considerations of security. There is a danger that once again we shall have the advocates contrasting the irrationality of deterrence with the rationality of disarmament, and then proposing practical measures that barely match the problem, yet still requires years of negotiations, or else we'll have grand schemes that can be too readily dismissed as utopian and unrealistic. The last time there were real breakthroughs in theorizing about nuclear disarmament was about half a century ago. Then campaigns for nuclear disarmament were active and made themselves heard, while in the universities and think tanks, new conceptual frameworks were being devised that sought to use nuclear weapons to keep world peace while reducing the risk that they might be part of a catastrophic war. This is what was in reaction to what were perceived to be the simplistic notions inspiring the disarmament campaigns. It led to theories of deterrence and arms control that still influence thinking about nuclear issues. So let's start with those debates of the 1950s, and with a vigorous proponent of general and complete disarmament, Philip Noel Baker. Noel Baker had played a major role in the foundation of the League of Nations and in the 1932 Geneva Disarmament Conference, and then as a Labour minister acting for Britain in the foundation of the United Nations. Nothing, not even the dismal experience of the interwar years, diminished his conviction in the supreme rationality of his cause. The only problem was it had not been pursued vigorously enough. In 1958, he set out his beliefs in a book called The Arms Race, a program for world disarmament. The next year, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. His Nobel lecture displays to the full the moral and intellectual confidence he had in a set of beliefs that he had first embraced as a young man. It makes no sense to talk about disarming, he asserted, unless you believe that war, all war, can be abolished. This was the heart of his beliefs. War was a terrible way to settle disputes. There were far better forms of dispute settlement, and they now needed to be abolished. applied. Unless there is an iron resolution to make it the supreme object of international policy and to realize it now, he insisted, I believe that all talks about disarmament will fail. So his objectives were hardly modest. He wanted an answer to the problem of war, not just nuclear war, and saw the remedy in part in general disarmament, not just nuclear disarmament. The other parts of the remedy will be provided by the United Nations and collective security arrangements. He didn't claim to be seeking an end to conflict, but there was a clear message that nothing was at stake in any conflict that involved the major powers for which it was worth risking war. When preparing his book on the arms race, Noel Baker had recruited a bright young Australian to help him out. The partnership didn't last. Hedley Bull soon became convinced that Noel Baker's approach was both dated and mistaken. It would never make much progress, which is just as well, as otherwise it would make a bad situation worse. As a precocious 26-year-old, he published a trenchant review of the arms race in 1959, which remains a seminal statement of the arms controller's critique of the disarmers. At its heart was an analysis of the relationship between disarmament and peace. Bull offered a succinct, realist explanation of why general and comprehensive disarmament was probably impossible. Quotes, in an international society in which war is a possible outcome between politically competing states, and there is no supreme coercive authority, a state can provide for its security and protect its interests only by its own armed strength and that of its allies. This is the context in which states have armaments and maintain their own control over the level of those armaments. Disarmament can occur, but only as a result of a prior reduction in tension, because contrary to the belief of the disarmers, quote, armaments are a consequence, not a cause of political tension, and so disarmament can only occur in the wake of a political agreement. Disarmament a la Noel Baker required substituting a system based on states taking responsibility for their own security with an alternative system based on collective security. The key principle would be that any act of aggression, anywhere, by anyone, against anyone, will be resisted by all the members of the system collectively. Faced with this threat of overwhelming power, no state will resort to aggression. This Bull described as, quote, a quite abstract and unhistorical conception of international relations, in which states are bloodless, passionless units, having no natural sympathies or antipathies, loyalties or hostilities, and like the citizens of Victorian tracts on representative government, are moved only by the rational contemplation of right or interest. I will return later to this danger of abstract and unhistorical conception. Bull's view was that the nuclear stalemate is a preservative of peace and should therefore be left well alone. This explained why Noel Baker seemed such a lone voice. The focus now, and Bull was very much of the trend, was on second-order questions such as nuclear testing. And contrary to Noel Baker's view that armaments could go because war was now an anachronism, Bull believed that war was anachronistic because of the terrible armaments. In this respect, therefore, the function of nuclear armaments in the international system at the present time is to limit the incidence of war. The situation may not have been satisfactory, but it was unlikely to be abandoned without confidence in the replacement. Bull concluded, in the present world, states are only likely to conclude a general and comprehensive disarmament agreement, are not only unlikely to conclude a general and comprehensive disarmament agreement, but are behaving rationally in refusing to do so. And disarmament policy from the mid-1950s onwards had increasingly reflected the view that nuclear weapons could play a constructive role by underlining in the starkest possible way the dangers of all-out war. The key insight was to accept that mutual vulnerability was the source of stability, which it might be perilous to disrupt, for example, through the development of effective anti-missile missile systems. This insight dominated strategic debate, culminating in the American embrace of the doctrine of mutual assured destruction. Now, though in some respects this debate still seems fresh, the great power paradigm within which it was framed is now dated. For Noel Baker, it was natural to suppose that as armaments caused war, then special responsibility lay with those states who had acquired the most armaments of the highest quality, the great powers. For Bull as well, there was no doubt that the key decisions on war and peace were to be taken in a relatively few capitals. There were, after all, at the time, only 3 nuclear powers. A political agreement between NATO and Warsaw Pact to end their differences and together construct a just new order, or simply an understanding that they dare not push their differences too far, were alternative responses to the problem of war, to large-scale disarmament and handing over sovereignty to a reconstituted United Nations. For Bull and many since, nuclear weapons reinforced stability and so made the balance of power less dangerous. For Noel Baker, they confirmed the need to abandon the old ways of power politics before the madness killed us all. The fact that official thinking followed Bull rather than Noel Baker reflected the key features of the Cold War: the bipolar antagonism, with both sides each led by a superpower and in broad terms equal in key military capabilities, especially in the nuclear sphere. As a result, the relationship acquired significant elements of balance in both political and military terms and came to be institutionalized, with elements of both antagonism and cooperation in the relationship. Upon these elements of cooperation, it proved possible to build. Whether talking about their military programs or arms control initiatives, both sides learned to describe their goals in terms of stability and followed measures designed to sustain political control at times of crisis, to ensure that the caution induced by mutual assured destruction was not lost in moments of panic or through failures of communication. The aim was inherently conservative, not so much to create a new stability, but to consolidate one that already existed. The surrounding rhetoric might claim that events were hurtling out of control in some mad momentum of an arms race, or that the aggression implicit in a Soviet military buildup was creating a new and imminent threat. But in reality, the relatively stable conditions infused all actions. New weapon systems were prepared for a decade ahead on the assumption that the strategic environment would barely have changed, while arms control negotiations were conducted at leisure over prolonged periods. Arms control and its associated activity became one mechanism for adjusting superpower relations. The signals sent through the enthusiasm and seriousness with which the negotiations were conducted communicated warmth or anger according to the general state of the Cold War. No independent body was established to assess compliance with treaty provisions and penalize transgressions. No third parties were involved at all. Because the agreements reflected and reinforced a strategic balance, there were limits to the advantages which might be gained by cheating, and also limits to the response an aggrieved party would have if cheating was discovered. The invocation of ultimate punishments to enforce treaties was precluded by the very circumstances they sought to control. Because a state could not be made to comply with a treaty, if it nevertheless did so, this could be read as an important statement of goodwill and confirmation that if honoured, it honoured its obligations. Indeed, a whole theory was developed to prove that intrusive verification and surveillance of regular military activities could have a significant value of its own, beyond the substance of that being verified, in building confidence between potential belligerents and so softening antagonism. Inevitably, this all meant that a substantial amount of arms control activity took on the form of a sort of audit, counting items in known inventories and checking them against the amounts declared. Arms control was a natural extension of statescraft. It represented a medium by which great powers conveyed their readiness to reach some sort of understanding with each other, demonstrating respect for vital interests and a capacity to make commitments and accept responsibilities. The stability model upon which all this was based became irrelevant at the point of its greatest triumph, when decades of arduous negotiations suddenly concluded with intricate treaties on conventional arms and strategic arms, and also, of course, the end of the Cold War. This event settled the debate over whether measures of disarmament might be the key to an improvement in political relations, or whether they must wait upon such an improvement taking place for other reasons. The manner of the Cold War's conclusion confirmed that cooperative agreements on armed forces are shaped by, rather than shape, core political relations. Thus, the conditions which obtained in the late 1980s made traditional arms control and even measures of disarmament more possible to achieve, but also rendered the agreements largely irrelevant. The value of the negotiating process had been in its informal aspects, as they provided important opportunities for communication and reassurance. In practice, these negotiations reinforced the dominant political tendency of the time. So when tensions were increasing, the negotiations could aggravate the process through, for example, rows over compliance or intransigence over apparently trivial points of negotiating detail. But when tensions were easing, it could accelerate an improvement in relations, as with the spate of agreements from 1987 to 1990. Now, all this suggests that disarmament campaigns must work with the grain of international relations, and in particular avoid what Ball described as, quote, a quite abstract and unhistorical conception of the system, deprived of its cares and passions and driven by an uncommon urge to rationality. Current thinking on disarmament and the various plans to get to zero, however, risk falling into this trap by requiring a sharpness and continuity of purpose over an extended time. All nuclear powers must be engaged and all must accept the project's logic. The process can be staged, but clearly the larger arsenals must come down before the smaller arsenals can come into play, but at some point everybody must disarm together in an orchestrated and synchronized process. To switch metaphors, the project takes the form of a grand geopolitical engineering enterprise. All working parts of the international system are examined to see how they need to be tweaked or transformed to contribute to the ultimate goal. Consideration is given to the vital interests of the key players, as well as to the areas where they might reasonably make compromise. Barriers are to be cleared by judicious treaty language here, a technical fix there, and a confidence-building measure to follow. This can't be rushed. It will take time to gain the requisite political support and then to implement. Decommissioning is expensive and slow. But while it would be nice to think that such grand schemes can be carried forward by reasonable people, making demonstrable progress at a steady pace and without breaking ranks, this is inherently unlikely. Governments change, as do their priorities, and policy will always be influenced by the interaction of the particular issue, undoubtedly of weighty historical significance, with whatever happens to be on the public agenda at the time and the passing concerns of the moment. Now there is no domestic clamour for governments to fast forward on disarmament. If things do start moving, it is possible to imagine not only great cheers of enthusiasm, but also nationalist politicians warning that security is being put at risk and demanding a halt to such naivety. If progress was really made towards abolition, then nerves would have to hold. As the numbers go down, the significance of individual nuclear devices goes up. Core issues can no longer be fudged. Normal diplomatic ruses, procrastination, creative ambiguity won't suffice. There can be no question of hanging on to some nuclear advantage after others have disarmed. The agreement and the process would have to be both transparent and definitive. The international system's dynamic, constantly changing character should warn against contemplating a grand disarmament plan along traditional lines. We need a new theory because we have a new system. And I wanted now to move to what I think are two features of this new system, one of which is hopeful and the other less so. The hopeful feature I would describe as the end of the great power era. Without wishing to speculate on future sources of conflict, ignore the potential significance of tension points around Russia's and China's peripheries, dismiss scenarios for matters getting out of hand through careless diplomacy or inadvertent provocations, or deny the residual influence of traditional balance of power thinking. But all of that, there's no reason to suppose that the greatest danger to global stability lies in a major war between the great powers. And this does seem to me a critical difference between the current time and those when Noel, Baker, and Bull were writing. Absent the great colonial rivalries or ideological competitions of the past, and given the interdependencies between the major economies and the particular strengths of the United States and its allies, we've moved significantly away from the old model of the international system and the sort of dangers that preoccupied both Noel Baker and Bull. This is why there has been a modicum of nuclear disarmament over the past two decades, and why it's widely held to be a propitious time to make the final push to zero. But the second, and less hopeful feature of the system, is that in many parts of the world, people suffer from multiple problems leading to chronic instability. Many states often quite recently independent, suffer from weak economies, deep social cleavages, and immature political institutions. When they fracture, this can lead to terrible violence, on occasion spreading into their wider neighborhoods. Instead of thinking about balancing the power of states with aspirations to be as great or even greater, it has become necessary to consider how to compensate for frailties of this sort. A new role has been identified for the major powers in addressing these conflicts, and there have been tentative moves in this direction. The reasons for the tentativeness are not hard to discern. Distinctive interests in particular parts of the world, uncertainties over how to address the issues of religion and identity, which often seem to drive conflict, the dangers, for example, of terrorism, of getting entangled in distant conflicts, and the reluctance to expend too much blood and treasure in direct intervention. Nonetheless, elements of a rudimentary collective security system are in place, whereby the major powers do accept some responsibility to act in the face of gross breaches of international law or to prevent or alleviate humanitarian disasters. Noel Baker and those currently working in his tradition would be astonished to be told that the International was starting to work along the lines that they had advocated. This is not really what we had in mind, they would complain. They would note that the United Nations Security Council does not apply international law in a disinterested manner, and that the majority of countries are content to leave it to a few to enforce its resolutions. The great powers act in line with the Council when it suits them, but act outside when it does not. They fail to act when they should and then rush in when they shouldn't. My point is not that this is or even is close to being a functioning classic collective security system. It's only that we do not get and should not expect designer world orders engineered to ensure that they work smoothly and safely at all times. Instead, systems evolve through jerks and starts and occasional backward movements in messy and sometimes contradictory ways. On occasion, though, crises are handled efficiently and effectively. On occasion, everything seems to go wrong. This observation seems to me to have important consequences for how we treat issues of arms control and disarmament. The old arms control models are not wholly irrelevant. They may retain some validity in the US-Russian nuclear relationship and anywhere where there is a possibility for a dyadic balance of power, for example, India and Pakistan. Old arms control explains how to add extra stability to an already stable relationship. Over the past 2 decades, however, the main security need has been to stabilize unstable situations. While in the Cold War context, a nuclear balance might have made some sense, at least qualitatively if not quantitatively, in these unstable situations, trying to get opposing conventional military forces in some sort of balance makes no sense at all. Even if one could produce an accurate measure, taking into account intangibles as training morale, tactical grasp, and strategic design, a conventional military balance doesn't produce stability. It just creates uncertainty about the outcome of armed conflict, when a definite imbalance produces the sort of certainty which reduces temptations to fight. Negotiating such balances also requires simplifying complex military relationships. So in conventional terms, the sort of approach that sought to gain military balances was anyway only really relevant to conflicts in which the danger was of a classic act of aggression across recognized borders and on terrain suitable for armored warfare. It had little significance for conflicts erupting out of civil wars or confused border disputes marked by skirmishing militias rather than regular battles directed against unwanted civilians as much as professional combatants. As NATO grappled with the dynamics of conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, it became apparent that quite different measures were required. Arms embargoes, air exclusion zones, air and land humanitarian relief corridors, control of artillery pieces, ceasefire lines, and so on. These measures were often clearly partial in controlling only limited types of military activity, while other types were unconstrained, and also partial, intending to favor one side rather than another in the conflict. They led to agreements which could not be self-regulating, but had to be externally enforced, using such non-military measures as diplomatic isolation, expulsion from international organizations, loss of sporting and cultural links, and economic embargoes, and in extremis, military measures from airstrikes to the introduction of multinational armies, notably often called stabilization forces. Whereas with traditional arms control, time was rarely of the essence, controversies over compliance could linger for months. In these more dynamic and often deteriorating situations, measures needed to work quickly. Regulating armaments in these conditions was bound to be pragmatic, judged according to immediate political effects rather than its long-term promise. These measures were complex passages and are apt to be expedient, temporary, and inconsistent. So this combination of good news and bad news has implications for the grand disarmament projects connected with nuclear weapons. In the past, the top priority was to disarm the great powers, and this now ought to be more feasible. Recent statements from both Washington and Moscow encourage optimism that strategic arms reductions can pick up again, getting numbers well down from the excessive stockpiles of the Cold War. Let's be clear, however, that this only removes surplus capacity. In the mid-1950s, there was a view that a balance of terror would be in place with a stockpile of 200 weapons on each side. The numbers game became complicated by questions of first and second strikes, but by the end of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union each had well over 20,000 warheads. The arsenals are now down to about 5,000 warheads, with about half that number operational. President Obama has mentioned a target for the next round of strategic arms talks of about 1,000. Getting down from gross overkill to mild overkill is to be welcomed, but the strategic impact will be marginal. Now, it will be argued that there are exemplary benefits of conspicuous disarmament by the declared nuclear powers in showing some regard for Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and reducing the excuses for would-be proliferators. I'm sure it won't do any harm, but it remains the case that individual nuclear decisions reflect particular security circumstances and that we must cope with proliferation that has already taken place. The greatest danger comes with those stockpiles that risk getting caught up in localized conflicts in South Asia, East Asia, or the Middle East. These conflicts do not fit in with the standard disarmament to zero model. First, the numbers of weapons involved are often tiny, certainly in comparison with the Americans and Russians. They remind us of the strategic significance of the difference between no weapons at all and just a few, which is far greater than the difference between just a few and quite a lot. Secondly, they undermine the neat notion that the only real value of nuclear weapons is to deter their use by others. This was never the case even during the Cold War. If it was the case, it would mean that nuclear weapons could be extracted from post-1945 international history and everything else would remain the same. Clearly that's nonsense. The intensity of the Cold War, the formation of alliances, the occasional crises and their eventual resolution were all influenced in some way by nuclear weapons. This is also very much the case in those regional conflicts currently influenced by the actual or prospective introduction of nuclear weapons. Third, the measures necessary to stabilize these conflicts may involve recourse to what was known as extended deterrence. That is, the ability of non-nuclear powers to draw on the strength of nuclear powers in the face of severe threats. For example, if an Iranian bomb is not to encourage wider proliferation in the Middle East, there may be demands for guarantees to states that feel threatened. And this could disrupt the process of great power disarmament. And lastly, there's a serious risk that they might get used, either through anger or accident. To say the least, this could have a disruptive effect on the orderly and planned progression to abolition. The fact that we don't worry about all of this as much as we might, or indeed should, illustrates the extent to which the norm of non-use has become so ingrained that even when we contemplate a major effort to rid the world of these weapons, we can do so without a sense of a race against time. At the great power level, this may be warranted. At the lower levels, it may be unduly complacent. We cannot even assume that actual use will necessarily produce a clamour for abolition. If the use were perceived to have served some strategic purpose, then the consequences could be to encourage holding on to arsenals and more proliferation. It's vital, therefore, that nuclear weapons do not get drawn into active conflicts. In this regard, the key measures may be drawn from the old Cold War handbooks of crisis management. Small forces and regional conflicts are already a top priority for international diplomacy, and rightly so. If we accept that the basic objective is to avoid war, and especially nuclear war, then this may require a range of regional and international interventions, which may well include the regulation of armaments, but of the type we've already seen in the conventional sphere in areas of instability, that is, expedient, temporary, and inconsistent. There may not be a great fit between the particular needs connected with these unstable situations and the grander disarmament plans. This can be seen in such issues as the influence of the US-India nuclear agreement on non-proliferation norms, plans to cope with chronic instability in Pakistan should it affect nuclear facilities, possible tolerance of high levels of uranium enrichment by Iran in return for a promise not to actually fabricate weapons, special concessions to North Korea in the face of its nuclear extortion. So while there may be a strand of the disarmament project that is long-term and unidirectional, there is another strand that is bound to be opportunistic and short-term. To conclude, the founding assumption for any new theory of disarmament must be the same as the old. It's a means to an end and not an end in itself. And the true end is the prevention of nuclear war. We can agree that total abolition of nuclear weapons is the best way to achieve this, but only so long as the process itself doesn't trigger the event we are trying so hard to avoid. This can best be achieved by constant attention to the changing nature of the international system, and not by setting down plans and schedules to be pursued doggedly without regard to the wider context. What is new in the current situation is that the conceptual problem is not so much bringing down the arsenals of the great powers. It remains a practical problem, of course, but there really is no good reason why stocks should be as high as they are, and they can be reduced drastically without any risk to international stability or national security. The conceptual problem now resides in the interaction between small arsenals and complex and often highly volatile regional settings where political relations are strained, and how this might impact on the more orderly processes of disarmament that are now envisaged. And that's why we need a new theory. Thank you.